Thanks, John, and I promise I will deliver on that description for you today. So I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Southern Paiute people, their elders past, present, and emerging. And thank you very much for the invitation. Las Vegas is an interesting place to come to talk about ethics, but I'll do my best. So my name's Matt Beard. I'm from a non-profit organisation called the Ethics Centre. We're based in Sydney, Australia. We've been around for about 25 years, and what we do is we get at the coalface with institutions, organisations, and people who are struggling to make sense of the ethical issues that arise throughout every single one of our lives. And what we do is we try to take all of the resources that sit in 2,500 years of philosophy that are performed in research institutions and translate that into practical tools that help people to make better choices, to live more meaningful lives, and to shape a better society for all of us. And one of the questions that we have frequently been asked about over the last few years has been technology, whether that's AI or big data or social platforms and their role in free speech. We've been asked about all of these ticket items, and so we decided to pool our resources and produce a white paper called Ethical by Design: How to Build Principles for Good Technology, which is where the title of this talk has come from. And I know that swag's really popular at tech conferences, so we've got some hard copies of the paper, which if you ask a good question at the end, you'll get a copy of. But make sure it's a good question, because we're a non-profit, so we had to sack 3 people to print that paper. So please value it. What I want to talk about today is how ethics in technology can be so much more than just the big ticket items that we hear about. It can be so much more than privacy breaches. It can be so much more than questions around genetic editing or social platforms and free speech. It's about making sure that our designs are the absolute best that they can be. And I want to start by giving you an example of how ethical missteps can take something that was awesome and make it less awesome, but also how it can refine an already great product into something more. So I want to start by talking about Pokemon Go. So who played Pokemon Go? Who still plays Pokemon Go? Much less people, yeah. But Pokemon Go launched in 2016, and a little bit of the history of the product. It launched off the back of an existing augmented reality game called Ingress, which combined data from Google Maps with an OpenStreetMap display, and it allowed players to crowdsource particular locations of significance, and different factions would battle it out for control over these locations by checking in at those locations. Then they put Pokemon skins on it, and it got so much more popular. They've partnered with Starbucks, with Apple and Sprint. By the end of 2018, they'd turned a profit of $3 billion. But more importantly than just the business story, it's awesome. Pokemon are really fun. It gets people active. Instead of gaming in your lounge room, you get to go out into the world and breathe fresh air and move your body. You engage with fellow gamers in the real world as opposed to intermediated on screens with all of the psychological and ethical challenges that gives rise to. And Pokemon Go, even though it's fading in popularity now, is going to come back. They're already working on a Harry Potter version of Pokemon Go where you can run around and you can meet characters from Harry Potter in the real world. I think they're going to put Dumbledore close to gay clubs, but never actually in the gay clubs, just to keep the magic alive. It's a little political Harry Potter commentary for you. We get to the real issues here. And although Pokemon Go is seemingly a really innocuous example to talk about in the ethics of technology, it actually gave rise to a range of different ethical problems. So, a Pokemon Go player crashes a car in Melbourne while playing the game. In New Zealand, a Pokestop is positioned at a Hells Angels nightclub, driving innocent gamers to criminal factions. One of the images, the green image there, is of Oakland in California, a predominantly African-American neighborhood, and you'll note that there are no Pokemon locations. So this game mirrors existing disadvantages. The grey image is in Taipei, when a Snorlax appeared and the entire city was shut down with people flocking to it. And perhaps my personal favorite from this museum of ethical horrors is a Pokemon called Koffing, which is a Pokemon that fights by exuding poison gas, which regularly appeared at the Holocaust Museum in DC. Now, not all the side effects of this has been bad. At the Tojimbo Cliffs in Japan, which are a prominent suicide spot, it was turned into a Pokemon Go location, and there were no recorded suicides after that point in the year that they were recording. So there are all of these side effects of what seems to be an innocuous technology. And the question is, how did this happen? How do fun and seemingly harmless intentions give rise to disruption, chaos, offense, injury, and possibly even death? And more importantly, how do we stop these things from happening again? So these are the issues that I want to talk to you about with my remaining time here today. And I want to talk about the ethics of technology as resting on three different pillars: knowing what's right, doing what's right, and nourishing what's right. These are, in the majority of cases, the sources of bad design, of unethical design that harms people, that degrades from society, that breaks the law. So let's break down each of these pillars one by one. So let's start with knowing what's right. So at this conference, you would have heard a whole heap of talk about how to make your teams more effective, to get great outcomes, to deliver quality service for customers. But the point that I want to make from an ethical standpoint is that cultures that make people efficient, that make people happy and productive, are only as good as the things that those teams produce. So I love coming back to this quote from Alice in Wonderland. Alice doesn't know where to go, and so she asks the Cheshire Cat, which path should I take? And he says, well, that depends where you want to go. And she says, I don't really care. He says, well, then do whatever you want. There is no point having a compass that guides you, a set of values in your organization, a playbook of things that you want to deploy, if you don't know what the end goal is. And that end goal, ideally, has to be something that you're doing that makes the world better. That means you need to know what better looks like. You need to know what right looks like. And that can be a tricky thing to figure out. Should an autonomous vehicle prioritize pedestrians or its passengers in a crash? When should a company take on defense contracts? How should tech designers use nudges and behavioral economics and unconscious biases in the ways that they build the products they serve? To take a more recent example, in the wake of the terrorist attacks in Christchurch to our neighbours in New Zealand, how much moderation should content receive online, and what role do social media platforms have in that content moderation? Should news content be permitted to screen content that would otherwise be taken off the platform? One of the major problems for social media platforms in being able to take down the Christchurch attack videos was that it was embedded in so many news pieces that were uploaded to the platform that it was really hard to distinguish what was journalism and what was trying to spread the terrorist message. Should free speech be protected at all costs? This is a big challenge for the project of ethical design, because in many cases the answers to these questions aren't clear-cut and they're not universally accepted. In fact, the question of autonomous vehicles recreates what philosophers call trolley dilemmas. And trolley dilemmas, Google them if you haven't watched The Good Place, which is where most of you will be familiar with it from. Trolley dilemmas are a case study in showing how divergent principles and different moral arguments can yield different but equally valid conclusions. So if ethical design is about building a better world, but what counts as better depends on what you think about ethics, that leads us to a problem. And the truth is, there are a bunch of different ways that you can think about ethics. These are 7 major paradigm ethical theories that exist just within the Western canon. This is not even taking into account other cultures. And I'm going to give you a little Ethics 101 in about 3 minutes now. I'm going to run through each of these. So let's start with existentialists. Existentialists are folks like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, and they're interested in what they call radical freedom. They think that there's no such thing as a person, a man, a woman, a teacher, a tech designer that exists in some essential form that we then kind of have to live up to that standard. They think we exist first and then we choose what we're going to become. And that makes us radically free. It also makes us radically responsible for all of the choices that we make. For existentialists, the ultimate ethical failure is living in bad faith. That's trying to escape from our freedom and responsibility by just doing what society tells us to do, doing what's going to be pleasing to our organization, letting customers bear the responsibility for the ethics of the stuff that we build. These are acts of bad faith. For existentialists, the goal is authenticity, is to live in light of our responsibility. Teleology comes from the Greek word telos, which means end or purpose. And teleology is the total opposite of existentialism. They're all about essence. What they're interested in is understanding what a thing is in its essential nature as a way of figuring out how we should act ethically with regard to that thing. They think we should align our activities and our choices and behaviours with the essential purpose of what something is. So for lawyers thinking about taking on a client who they think might be guilty or is guilty of a particularly odious offence, the question they should ask is, what is the purpose of the law and what is my role as a lawyer in regard to that? And in answering that question, they discover the ethical way that they should behave. Virtue theory goes all the way back to ancient Greece. It's about the oldest theory that we've got in the West. And they basically say that actions shape our character. The more times you act in a particular way, the more likely you are to do that thing. So the more times you act well, say you act generously, the more likely you are to be generous next time. The more times you act selfishly, the more likely you are to be selfish next time. They think that we should aim to become the best version of ourselves and make choices as though we were already that person. What would I do if I was the most virtuous person of me? Well, if I do that thing enough times, I'll actually become the most virtuous person of me. Contractualism is a theory that's basically about managing power. It says that institutions that have power, like the state or major businesses or essential service providers, have that power on the basis of the willing consent of society. And we should build societies and we should give institutions power on the basis of what would be agreed upon by every member of society. What is in all of our mutual best interests, and we build a society around that. Consequentialism does what it says in the box. It's all about consequences. It basically says in an ethical situation, you should weigh the benefits against the harms and choose the thing that leads to the greatest benefits or the least amount of harms. Now, there are different variations on consequentialism, but that's the general point. Deontology, the opposite of consequentialism. It says forget about outcomes, think about your duties and obligations. Regardless of what the good outcomes are going to be, if you say tell a lie, you have an obligation to tell the truth, so don't lie. And finally, relational ethics emerges as a way of saying we need to stop thinking about philosophy in abstract principles. What we need to do is think in terms of grounded connections to one another. They talk about the ethical action as one that gives voice and respect to existing relationships and connections and expresses care for the people with whom we're related. So that's 7 schools of thought in 70 seconds or so. Probably more than 70 seconds. All the academic jargon, all of the complexity, and all of these theories make claims to being the absolute answer to the question, what is good and right? What is the right thing to do? So when we're talking about ethical design, and philosophers who have been working on this for 3,000 years haven't been able to figure out the right thing to do, what possible hope can we have? And this is a kind of view that started to creep into the kind of discourse within the industry as well. I was recently sitting on a panel talking about AI, and when the conversation turned to ethics, another member on the panel who was a venture capitalist kind of scoffed, and when he was asked about ethics, he sort of said, well, do you mean teleological or deontological ethics? And he wasn't saying that as a way of saying, these are the two important ethical theories. He was saying that dismissively as a way of saying, well, if there are different schools of thought on this, why should we waste our time understanding it? And the problem with that is that it's unhelpfully true. Because if we take away this academic jargon and we translate these into ordinary language, we can see that although there might be technical areas where these different schools of thought will disagree, they agree on far more than they don't. So if I turn existentialism into taking responsibility, and turn virtue ethics into bringing out the best in people, and deontology into honouring commitments, consequentialism is getting good outcomes. So consequentialism and deontology are always talked about as rival concepts. But do we really think that it's impossible to get good outcomes and honour our commitments at the same time? When we take away the academic jargon? When we think about ethics in this way, it allows us to get at what's universal rather than be distracted by what's different. The differences do matter. Sometimes they are going to be really important. But the person who's best equipped to dealing with those points of difference is the one who has a well-rounded sense of all of the different things that are important in any given situation. And this is the kind of approach that we've tried to take in Ethical by Design. We've tried to take a range of different perspectives on the ethics of technology and on moral philosophy more generally, and turn them into a set of universal principles and practical kind of what we call like rules of thumb to translate those abstract principles into practice. And I won't have a chance to talk about those practical principles at any length today, but here are the high-level principles that we came up with. 8 of them. The first one, this is your no hat, no play policy when it comes to ethical design, is you think ought before can, you think should before could, okay? Jurassic Park, the inestimable Jeff Goldblum says, your scientists were so preoccupied with wondering whether they could that they didn't stop to think whether they should. Starting point for the ethics of technology in pop culture. It's not really, but I think it is. The fact that we can do something doesn't mean that we should. Non-instrumentalism. There are some things that just should not be treated as though they were part of your technical system. They are the beneficiaries of your system. In Australia, we see a lot of challenges with this with regard to the environment and crucial environmental and ecological systems which are treated as though they were just part of a broader energy market, a set of commodities to be harvested. But people can be treated in this way as well. Think about the way that some people are reduced to their data in the way that a number of big data systems used. They are just a tool in an aggregating machine that is designed to give answers to clients or customers, and they become part of a product system rather than the beneficiaries of that system. Self-determination, like at its core, technology is about empowering humans to do more than what they can do at the moment. But that means that it's all about freedom and choice. So technology that inhibits humans' freedom is going to be ethically problematic. Responsibility. A lot of the ethical issues that we see in the ethics of design are about ambiguities about who is responsible between a user and a designer. So the designer says, that's not how we specified, that's outside of the terms of use, that's not our responsibility. But the terms of use were so narrow that of course users were going to use them in different ways. Of course they could have anticipated that this was going to be used in ways that were outside of the terms of reference. So do they have responsibility for those uses if they were foreseeable? And we think they do. Net benefit. So for the consequentialists in the room, you still get a ring in. You maximize good and you minimize bad in your design. Fairness in technology means treating people in the same situation as though they were the same, and treating people who are in different situations as though they were different. So we need to think about both similarity and difference when we're talking through fairness. Accessibility. We design for the most vulnerable user. We don't accept edge cases. As soon as you say that you're designing an edge case, you're saying there are some people that I'm not building this for. There are some people who are not welcome to use this. Is that something you're comfortable saying? And if so, are you comfortable defending it publicly? And finally, purpose, which we've talked about a lot at this conference thus far, but be clear about what you're trying to achieve and design products that actually are fit to achieve that goal. So, that's it for doing what's right. And there's a lot more. This white paper is freely available online, so please Google it if you'd like some more information. I know that there's some stuff we're missing out on here. But it's not enough to know intellectually what's right. you then need to translate it into practice. How many people know that according to the American Heart Association, they should be doing about 30 minutes of brisk exercise a day? Well, you do now. For those who did, how many people do 30 minutes of brisk exercise a day? Right? Because intellect does not correlate to motivation, especially if we have to make a conscious choice every time, and we haven't built systems and processes that make it explicit when we should be thinking about that thing, carving out the time and opportunity to do so. So what I want to do now is move doing what's right, and I want to talk through 5, you can call them techniques or methodologies, you can call them plays, that you can use in your design process tomorrow to start to spotlight the ethical questions that might be at the heart of your design, which your current systems and processes could take into account if they just shifted the focus a little bit. And the first one is to ask yourself whether you're building the Death Star. So, I'm a bit of a pop culture nerd. So, for those who are Star Wars fans, and I presume there are a few of them, you've got the original sequel, which is like Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker blowing up Death Stars. You've got the prequels, which are about Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader. And then in between, you've got this little film called Rogue One, which is about how they steal the rebel plans which enable Luke Skywalker to blow up the Death Star. Now, before Rogue One comes out, there's this novel, and it's called Catalyst. And it's the story about how the Empire managed to build the Death Star in the first place. Tell me if this sounds familiar. They had a very large hierarchy. They had very siloed teams working in operations where they had particular functions and didn't know what the other teams were working on. There were only very few people who could see the whole picture and could bring all of the pieces of the puzzle together, which meant that someone working on a particular kind of hyperspeed transport, someone working on a particular laser functionality, someone working on how to grow sufficient amounts of food and water in space to feed large populations. We're all working on particular things and ended up building a weapon of mass destruction. So what might prevent this? Well, the lesson from this is, can we see the full picture of where this product is going from the position of the particular part of that we are working on at a given time? But the other lesson that we can ask is, what are some of the ways in which what I'm doing could be used to do bad stuff? What if my design fell into the hands of the Emperor? What would happen then? What are some of the things that would prevent that from happening? If we can anticipate a possible world where this is used by bad people to do bad things, how can we at the design stage head them off at the pass? If there are dual use capacities in your technology where it can be used for bad, are the risks worth it? There are lots of products that go to market with perfectly defensible reasons why they do that have dual use functionality. But what's important is at the design stage that you've taken responsibility for that and you've actually made a conscious calculation so that you can defend that. So, that's our first play. Are you building the Death Star? Can you see the full picture? Our next play is red teaming, which will be familiar for people who work in security. It'll also be familiar for people who played Pokemon Red, which of course you should have played because you can get Arcanine and Scyther and Primeape and Vileplume and all of the cool Pokemon. But setting that aside, red teaming in an ethical context is about addressing ethical negligence, which is a major source of ethical failure. It's about consciously creating distance and impartiality. At different points in our design cycle, we will feel like we have asked every question that needs to be asked, and we will anticipate every answer. And at that stage, it's the perfect moment to bring someone in who doesn't know about what you're doing, to explicitly ask all of the negative, risk-averse questions that you've already thought through, like naysaying at this point. What are the ethical pressure points here? What happens if we widen the circle of stakeholders a little bit more than what you have so far? Is there another way to solve this problem that has less trade-offs? Maybe you've got a good solution, but is there a better one? Have you stayed on brief, and was the brief a good one to begin with? So what would that have looked like if Niantic Labs had taken this on when they were building Pokemon Go? What might a red team have asked them? Well, they might have asked why people can't walk around without having their screens turned off. So a big part of Pokemon Go is hatching eggs. You need to take 10,000 steps to hatch an egg. But it only counts your steps if the screen is on, which one is really frustrating because it drains battery life. But secondly, means that as a safety hazard, people are continually looking at their phones instead of the environment around them. So we've got coffins appearing in Holocaust museums. One of the questions that a red team might ask is, have you talked to all of the people who you're building into this technology? Have you gotten their permission? How do you think that they might feel if they wake up tomorrow and suddenly 30 people steam into their restaurant to try to catch a Pikachu? Or in worst cases, steam into a funeral to try to catch a Pikachu, as has happened. Are there some places where infrastructure won't be there to support the amount of people you're sending to a particular gym? Are there some places that it just wouldn't be appropriate to create a Pokemon location? Will this encourage people to go where it's not safe? Some Pokemon only appear at night, so people go outside at night trying to catch Pokemon. But for me as a white guy, I have no problem going out at night safely. But someone who's African American in an urban community, that's a very risky proposition. So how do they accommodate for that? How do they build fairness into their design? These are all applications of different ethical principles translated and called to attention because we've invited people to take distance and practice skepticism. Our next play is what I call toddler talking, but in order to explain it, I need to explain a thing called affordance theory, in case you're not familiar with it. Affordance theory is an argument that says that affordances are things in our design that are not the explicit kind of function or purpose of our design, but they're clues as to how we should use the technology. They're little invitations. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. They might encourage you to use the technology in a particular way or discourage you from using it in another way. These are little conversation starters. They're invitation to say, here's how you should use me. Don't use me like this. Okay, so a door that has a lock on it has a particular set of affordances. It permits you from walking in without having permission to enter. Passwords do the same thing. If you think about privacy design, the accessibility of someone's privacy settings is an affordance. It either encourages them or discourages them from taking ownership of their own privacy settings. But affordances encourage us to think about seeing technology design as a conversation and thinking about it as a two-way relationship. So we usually think about technology design as, I have identified a problem, and here is my product, and it is here to solve that problem. But this tells us that it's got to be more fluid than that, because the users get to choose how they're going to respond to those affordances. You might encourage a user to use technology in a particular way, but they might say, no, I want to use it differently. And that's just like my son Darwin. This is my son Darwin. I miss him desperately. When he gets his hands on something new, he engages with it with one basic question in mind. How much freedom can I exercise over this thing? Can I throw it? Can I chew it? Can I paint with it? What can I do with it? Imagine if at a design level you thought about your users as asking precisely those questions, but where there were no verbal pieces of feedback you could give them to answer those questions. The only answer you can give them is built into your design. So you need to ask, if a user had no preconceptions about how they were going to use this technology, what could they discern simply from the way that you've designed this? So quick example, Pokemon Go set a speed limit at 20 miles an hour, at which point it would switch off and say you're going too fast to be able to use this, which seems to stop people from using it in cars. It also stops passengers from using it in cars, but it also permits people to use it in cars at relatively low speeds. Here's a quick point of reference. So the speed limit is 20 miles an hour. Usain Bolt, running at his fastest, goes 28 miles an hour. Dennis Cometto, who holds the world record for marathon running, does it at 13 miles an hour. So is your average Pokemon Go user on foot ever going to need to go 20 miles an hour in order to be able to play the game? So does this afford practices, does this permit practices like driving in vehicles at low speed that in fact we don't want users to be able to do? Is it actually prohibiting users from doing things they should be able to do, like use it when they're on a bus, or use it when they're a passenger in a car. A user's responsible for choosing whether it's safe to use it at a particular time or not. The next methodology is about how we have meaningful and inclusive conversations around design. So, just like we have a series of unconscious biases, we all have a default setting when it comes to thinking about ethics. At the Ethics Centre, we've developed a range of different kind of ethical profiles and tools that can diagnose what your ethical profile is, the way in which you tend to think about ethical problems. Now, you can have a very demographically diverse team who all think about ethical problems in the same way, and that's going to generate points of ethical negligence. So one opportunity is to invite teams, members within teams, to consciously take on particular ethical profiles and champion those ethical dispositions throughout the process to ensure that you've consciously called attention to all of the things that matter by acknowledging consciously different lenses. And the last play is what I call showing your work. This is a throwback to my high school maths teacher, who I didn't actually like, but has informed part of my professional work. You get 1 point for showing the answer, you get 3 points for showing you're working out. A crucial piece of the puzzle is in disclosing your reasons for making the choices that you did. Okay, if a consumer is going to use your product and it has risks and trade-offs involved, you should be disclosing them to them. The market is going to assume that if you have trade-offs in your product, that it's because you didn't think about them. And most of the time you did. So tell them about it. And then they can give you feedback and you can iterate and say, okay, we made the trade-off in the wrong way. We'll do it differently next time. So there's a few plays to focus on doing what's right. But these things alone aren't necessarily going to get us there, because we also need to nourish what's right. You can have all the best systems and processes in the world, but if they're just PDFs on a hard drive or tools you run through on autopilot, they are meaningless. We've just gone through a Royal Commission into banking and finance in Australia. Highly regulated space, huge financial penalties for wrongdoing, codes of conduct galore. Enron in the middle there had a fantastic code of conduct. It didn't mean anything for the simple reason that you have to give a fuck about this stuff. It's not enough to have policies and procedures, you have to care. So 2 of the theories we talked about were about developing dispositions and characteristics. This is virtue ethics. It's about becoming a champion of goodness, not just keeping it on an intellectual level. And care ethics. By thinking about particular relationships instead of abstract principles, sometimes we can lose the full picture of what's going on. Our actions aren't performed in a vacuum, but when we are anonymized from the people who are going to be affected, it can create moral hazards. So I want to quickly talk through a few examples of kind of philosophical best practice. A lot of you would have seen this book in airports, The Subtle Art of Giving a Fuck. We want the subtle art of actually giving a fuck, not of not giving a fuck. So here are 3 ways that I want you to think about doing this. The first is around incentives. What gets paid gets made. You can hire people for values, but then incentivize them based on outcomes or outputs. Time on site incentivizes people to make addictive technology. If 99% of your ad revenue is coming from ads, guess what you're going to incentivize? Storytelling. We are narrative creatures. So stories define us, and within an organization, the kind of stories around what it means to be an Atlassian, what it means to be a Googler, what it means to work at whatever organization that you do, the kind of crystallizing stories that form part of like folklore of your organization need to be built around ethics. They need to be defining moments where the values were lived despite there being high stakes. And finally, you need to choose your heroes wisely. Aristotle thought the best way to learn virtue was to have role models who we looked up to and emulated their behavior. So if our role models are people who perform really well, but they're actually kind of horrible human beings, what kind of a culture is that setting in the organization? So choose heroes on the basis of their ethical commitments, and then be really explicit with other people that that's why you look up to this person, because they care, because they take the time to think through vulnerable stakeholders. And most importantly, do it all the time. Do it when nobody's watching. Do it when it doesn't get you return on investment. Hypocrisy is the hill on which trust goes to die. And as you'll know, in an innovative context where you don't want too many constraints, you need to be trusted. Some of that trust probably also is built by constraints, but that's another conversation. I want to say one last thing about diversity really quickly. Thinking about ethics gives us a new way of thinking about diversity. It gives us two reasons why we should care about diversity. Firstly, because it gives us skin in the game. By seeking those who are most likely to be affected by the bad parts of our design, we have impetus, we have care for what happens. There's a story that a colleague, actually that's a point for another time, it's about reducing moral hazards and being clear on what's going to happen either way, who benefits and who suffers. A colleague tells me about an industrial plant who had this problem. They didn't want to pollute the water where their water outlet was on this plant. And so what they did to solve the problem was they put the outlet upstream from the plant, which meant everyone working in the plant had to drink the water that was flowing through the plant. It gave them skin in the game, and it meant that there was less motivation for them to not pay attention to these things. It also allows us to see the full picture. It's so much easier to have a clear view of a world that you have lived. So for example, if Niantic had spoken to African American developers from Pokemon Go, they might have been more alive to some of the issues with crowdsourcing that game based on Ingress, which was played by predominantly wealthy and white people. Ethical perspectives can shift and be more variable, but they are also correlated with culture, with class, with background. Thinking about those things allows us to see the full range of ethical perspectives and gives a clear picture of the effects, benefits, and uses of building. The whole point of talking about ethics is not just to end conversations and tell you what you can't do. It's to start conversations with stakeholders about making things the best that they can be. It's not just about putting out fires, it's about helping the flame to shine as brightly as it can be. It's an opportunity to harness and utilize creativity and innovation and give you the confidence that you're innovating well. So if design is about making great stuff, something can't be great unless it's good. Thank you very much.